In this video, we'll be installing this transmission mount on this 2007 Mazda CX-9. It's going to be located underneath your battery and battery tray. So in the engine compartment, underneath our battery, is going to be our transmission mount. To get there, we're going to need to remove our intake box and possibly some of our intake tube. We'll start here at our box. There's a clip down here holding in your harness for your sensor. Just going to pop that clip out of the top of the box here. On the bottom side of this sensor here, you'll see a little red tab. I'm going to use a panel tool and just pop that tab out. And that's a lock. Underneath there, you'll find a clip. Push that clip, pull your plug out. You can set this harness aside. Now to open up your air intake here to replace your filter or remove it, we're going to push these two tabs back. And now you can lift that intake box up from the back side or the inside of the motor and slide it inward. Now for us, we're going to remove this. So there is a hose clamp here or a hose band here. We're going to remove or loosen the 10 millimeter. And that should allow us to twist our intake box and pull right out. We can set this aside. So now we're going to remove the bottom of our intake box. You can see we're held in by one bolt up top here. It's going to be a 10 millimeter. So now we have an air intake tube here. It's going to be held in by two bolts. This tube is actually going to go into the housing. So we'll remove these two 10 millimeter bolts. And if you lift this up, now see you got a little bit more movement. Now what we can do is take out our air filter. And now what you'll need to do is grab a hold of your intake box here and just pull straight up. I'm going to guide this all out as one piece. And what was holding in the bottom are two pins into two rubber grommets. So you're going to pull those straight up and out. So the next thing we're going to have to do is remove our battery. We're going to start with a 10 millimeter on our negative terminal. I'm just going to loosen it up and remove the terminal. Set it out of the way. And then we'll come over to our positive. We'll open up our cap, find another 10 millimeter here, and we'll loosen that one up. And remove that terminal as well. Move that out of the way. From here, our battery is held down with this crossbar, two 10 millimeters on two J hooks. So what we're going to do is loosen up one side. I'm going to pull that up and remove that nut. Now you actually don't need to go through the process of taking this out. I'll show you on the other side. Because this side's loose, what you can actually do is just shift everything over, push down and twist that arm a little bit, and remove the J hook. All right, we can set this aside. The next thing we're going to do, open up our battery handle. We're going to rotate our battery forward, take the battery sleeve and the battery right out of the vehicle. So now underneath our battery, on our battery tray, we have a few more 10 millimeter bolts. We'll go ahead and take those out. So we have a nut here in front, which held on our positive cable. Two bolts. and a bolt in the rear. And now our tray is loose with the exception of this harness in the back. Okay, so our harness in the back here is held on with this metal bracket with this 10mm back here. So we're going to pull this forward a little bit, gain a little bit more access to this bolt, that nut. Now this bracket should come off of the tray. You have to slide that down, kind of work around this harness. Let's just use a panel tool to help pop this bracket out of the tray. And then we can remove our battery tray. So now at this point, we're going to want to support our transmission from underneath. We're going to use a floor jack. We're just going to crank up until our floor jack meets our transmission and maybe another half a crank just to put a tiny bit of upward pressure, and then we're good to remove our mount. So here is our transmission mount. But because our bolt is right here, right, we're going to get this bracket out of the way. You can get in here with a ratchet and take your time and back that bolt out, but we're going to take this bracket right out of the way. Two 12mm bolts. And with that last bolt out, we can take this bracket right out. So now on our transmission mount, we have two top-down bolts. They're going to be 14mm. Go ahead and take those out. So now our last bolt for our mount is going to be this one going forward to backwards. It's going to be a 17mm right in the center. Now again, you noticed a slight engine drop on that one. So what we'll do is just give our floor jack another crank up and continue to take that bolt out. So now that we have that center pin out, we have 3 bracket bolts going straight down into our transmission. Here again, going to be 17mm. We'll start with this one, take those out. Next one's right up here. This is actually going to be a nut on a stud. And if we follow this back towards the firewall, we'll have one more right in that area, which looks like another nut on a stud. Okay, so now we have a washer we have to remove. We have another washer. So to give us a little bit more clearance to remove our bracket here underneath this arm, we're going to remove the 2 bolts holding in this bracket back here. They're going to be 10mm. Now what we should have is a little more play here, which allows us to lift this bracket up and off the studs, just like that. All right, still will be a little bit of work to rotate this up and out. So now we have 2 more bolts on the bottom of our mount going towards our driver's side wheel. They're going to be 14 millimeters. So for a little bit better access to this back bolt and this front bolt, if you decide to, you can lower your transmission a little bit, which will drop this block here and the stud on this side a little bit lower so it's out of your way, which will give you a little bit more room to work. Just want to be careful not to go too far, as you don't want to put any undue stress on the rest of your mounts. Here's your final bolt, and now we can lift our transmission mount straight up and out. So we're going to take our transmission mount, we're going to take the vehicle side, not the motor side, lower it into place. We're going to line up our top 2 holes, which hopefully should help us line up our front 2 bolts. We're going to start those by hand. We have one here and one on the other side. Now the back side bolt is probably the most difficult. Again, to gain a little bit more access to this back bolt, we did lower our transmission or our motor slightly, because just behind this back bolt is one of our studs. And that's causing us a little clearance issue to get our tools in there. So now that we have both bolts started, we'll go ahead and snug them up. So now that we have these snugged up, we'll just come back and give them an extra turn. Same in the rear. Alright, those are nice and tight. We'll go ahead and install our 2 top-down bolts now. Alright, so our 2 bolts here on top. Let's get them started by hand. We'll come back and tighten them down. All right, so we have the vehicle side mount in place. Now we have to put in the mount that connects it to the transmission. And remember, we have to feed it underneath this cable here. So we're going to take that mount, we're going to angle it down and get the front end under there and up and onto the studs front and back. Like so. All right, now remember, we lowered our transmission, so we're not going to be matched up with this mount. But before we raise our transmission back up, we're going to put a couple of bolts in and get this centered in. So the first thing we're going to do is put in our spacers or washers here. We have one, and then we have our bolt. Drop it right in. Get that started by hand. We then have another washer or spacer here for this center stud and our nut. And then in the back stud here, we just have our nut. Now what we're aiming to do right now is get this bracket loosely snugged up to the transmission block. That way when we raise our transmission back up to put our center bolt through, we have just a little bit of movement. And that little bit of movement will help us align that center bolt. All right, so we're loosely snugged up. We have a little bit of movement here. We'll go ahead and raise our transmission back up. And once we're in line, we can take our bolt and send it through. So now that we have our center bolt here snugged up, we'll come back, we'll tighten everything down, and then we'll torque it all down together. Now our 3 bracket bolts are going to be torqued down to 55 foot-pounds. And then our center bolt here going through is going to be 65 foot-pounds. So now we're going to put down our 2 bolts holding this cable in place. All right, so there's going to be one in the back, one in the front. And once we get our hands in there, probably won't be able to see much. All right, so there are your 2 bolts started. So the next step of our reassembly is going to put down our bracket for our air intake box. We're going to line up that tab into the slot and line up our bolt holes. Take our bolts, start them. Go ahead and tighten these down. Now we can take and put in our battery tray. Just going to lower it right down into position. So now we have our battery tray down. We're going to focus on our rear bracket here with our harness. We're actually going to take the battery tray slightly back out, twist it sideways, and we can work on putting this harness and bracket back into place. Now the easier thing to do, I think, here is work the battery tray onto that stud versus trying to move that harness onto the battery tray. And just go ahead and turn it, lower it down into position. To hold that stud in place before we go any further, we'll put our 10mm nut on top. And now we know it can't back out and fall off. We're going to take our tray and put it back into position. We have 2 bolt holes here lined up. We can then take our front positive cable, put that into the tray. We'll take our nut and thread that on. Now from here, we'll have 1, 2, 3 10mm bolts to put back in. We're a little misaligned, so we'll loosen this up a little bit. So you won't be able to see much of this once the battery is installed. So we're going to show you here real quick how your J-hook actually hooks in. It's going to go down here and it's going to be hooked into this little area. When you tighten the top nut, it'll put pressure downwards on this top plate securing your battery. When you want to loosen your J-hook, you're going to loosen up that nut. You're going to push that J-hook down and twist it. And then you'll be able to pull it out of locked position. All right, so now we're at a point where we want to take our floor jack out from underneath our transmission just to make sure everything stays in place. This is a good point before you start to put everything back in. So we'll go ahead and we'll lower our floor jack. Your transmission may settle just a little bit, but it shouldn't be noticeably dropped down. If everything looks good, go ahead and pull it out. All right, so now we'll take our battery and put it back into the tray. Again, if you have a battery sleeve or a battery protector here, you want to make sure it's inside that tray. Go ahead and put your handle down, center up the battery in the tray, and we can put our battery hold down back in place. So now with our battery back in place and our handle closed, we're going to put our battery hold down back in. So we're going to put the inside J-hook into place. We're going to keep some tension on that cross brace here, and we're going to put our outside J-hook into place as well. And we can tighten that down now. While doing this, you want to make sure that your battery is inside of this top brace. Go ahead and tighten it down. Make sure your battery doesn't want to move. It's locked in. We can move on to putting our terminals back on. So now we're going to connect our negative terminal. Swing it up over, push it all the way down, and a 10mm socket. Just tighten that up enough so that it doesn't spin. Go ahead and check it. Make sure you can't rotate it. We can move on to the positive. We'll do the same thing with the positive. We'll actually align this cover, put it on, put our positive terminal on all the way down, pull back our cover, make sure our terminal's all the way down, and we'll tighten this down as well. Give it a little spin, make sure it doesn't move. Looks good. Put your cover back on. So the next thing we're going to do is put in our air intake box. Right down here we have 2 receiving grommets for the 2 pins on the bottom of our air intake box. So we're going to lift up our intake tube a little bit, slide in our intake box here. I'm going to try and line up those 2 pins. Sometimes it's easiest to locate your other bolt holes. That'll give you an idea if you're close or not. Once you feel like you're in those grommets, go ahead and push down. Seat those 2 pins, and then we can move into bolting down the rest of our intake box. Right, so the first bolt we're going to put in is right here. It's going to be our air intake to this bracket. And then up front here, where our fresh air comes in, we have 2 bolts. And then right across the way, we have 1 more. All right, and now is when you put your air filter back in. Remember, the fins will go down. And then we can take our cover. Now what we're going to do with our cover is we're going to slide this tube here into our intake tube. You do have a couple of notches here which we're going to have to align with this tube. So we're going to push it straight in, give it a little rotation if we have to. Just like that. Now we're not going to tighten down our band clamp just yet. We're going to actually put our cover into place and lock it down. So our cover, to put it into place, we're going to angle the front with these 3 notches down. We're going to slide them into the receiving holes there, push in. Push down, and there are 2 clips on the back that will lock now. All right, so first clip here, just pull it up, pull it right on top. Second clip, in a little bit further. Same process, pull it up, pull it right over the top. So the next thing we have here is our plug with our security lock on it. We're going to push that straight on, all the way in. You hear a click, and then to lock it in place, push that red tab back in. If we follow this line down, we have that one clip holding our harness in place that we removed. Go ahead and push that right down onto that cover. And now the final thing we're going to do is tighten up our band clamp. Before we do that, we'll just make sure that these two are together all the way. Keep a little pressure on there, holding them together, and we'll tighten that clamp up. That's it.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.